Code Vein sure is one of the video games of all time. I don't know, there's a lot I like about it, but there's also just as many things to dislike. The combat's at the very least decent, because it's basically just Bloodborne with anime characters, but it definitely lacks the polish, like how boss tracking is so terribly forced that you can see their models turning on the axis, hey, this reminds me of, just so they can reach their intended target, an issue which is compounded thanks to the inclusion of AI companions, which are otherwise welcome inclusions. Character creation is great, but also has way too limited options for clothing and weirdly selective inclusion of certain colors, materials, and patterns, depending on the clothing or accessory in question. Armor and masks also don't tend to meld well with the created characters and can't be altered to suit them. There are plenty of mechanics to play around with, but none of them really gel with one another either. The game features basically every Souls mechanic known to man, and yet you can beat it with as little as one weapon and some basic upgrading and leveling. Environments are mostly bland, but the artistic direction itself is pretty good, stunning at times even, and some areas look genuinely fantastic. There are times where I'm honestly taken aback by how good the game can look, and other times where I'm fighting to hold back either frustration or laughter with how bad it can look. The characters are fairly likable, and the casting is a veritable who's who of iconic voice actors, but the line delivery on offer is as flat as a 2-day open can of soda, and the storytelling, oh boy, it's not good. I honestly don't think I could tell you a single thing about the game's story with any degree of confidence because of just how little things make sense. It tries really hard to go for that Souls brand of showing but not telling, but a little bit of telling would have been nice from time to time. I mean, at least most Souls games will give you enough of a starter's understanding to know what the heck it is you're even doing, but Code Vein is just so strangely obtuse and abstract about so many of its plot elements, and it's just way too hard to follow. Does that make me a stupid dumb casual who can't keep up with lay complex storytelling? I don't really care. I think the insatiable desire this game had to be featured among the Souls foe genre was more than anything its true Achilles. Unfortunately, the game is more virgin-born than it is anime Souls. I give it a 5 out of 10. There's plenty to like, but there's also plenty to dislike, and I think they more or less balanced out. I wouldn't call it a good game, and I wouldn't call it a bad game. It's just kind of a game that you can enjoy, if that makes sense. Personally, I really enjoy playing it for the most part. I mean, it's literally just Opie Bloodborne, and I'll definitely be coming back for the Platinum Trophy eventually, but I'd be lying if I said the game didn't feel like an ironically soulless Soul clone that was made only for the sake of appealing to anime audiences who will play just about anything with an edgy aesthetic and waifus to argue over. Oh yeah, that reminds me. Coco is the best girl. So, for those of you unaware, the original Dead Space is one of my all-time favorite video games, easily among my favorite horror games ever, and if you want me to be completely unfiltered and brutally honest about it, this is easily one of the best remakes of any game that I have ever played. Not only is it extremely faithful to the original, but there is so much added in that elevates it above the original experience. Not only did they implement the zero-gravity mechanics of the Dead Space sequels, but they did it damn near flawlessly. Weaker sections of the original game, like the turret set piece, are completely overhauled and far superior to how they were in the original. And the newer zero-G mechanics are implemented so seamlessly that I wouldn't blame newcomers for thinking this was exactly how the original was played. I honestly can't think of anything about the gameplay that I found to be particularly weak, barring a handful of nitpicks like the occasionally finicky AI, some ragdoll physics fever dreams, the pulse rifle audio being kinda weak compared to the original, and Leapers still being the most annoying necromorph for the second consecutive decade. But it's not just the gameplay that's been improved. The story and characters are honestly magnitudes above those of the original. That's not to say that the original Dead Space didn't tell a solid story, but that the remake knew exactly what to improve on and what to leave alone. First and foremost, Isaac is now fully voiced, whereas in the original he was a silent protagonist. I enjoy silent protagonists for the most part, but when it comes to this particular story, it's far more effective having Isaac in a speaking role. Not only is Gunnar Wright just perfect as Isaac, seriously I love this guy, but it's far more satisfying to see Isaac playing such an active role in the story. In the original, Isaac just kinda went where people told him to go, but in the remake we get to see him analyze the situations he finds himself in and work things out to solve his and others' problems. Not only does it make him more likable as a protagonist, but the improved characterization elevates the story beats well beyond the impacts they had in the original. Again, the original Dead Space was perfectly serviceable as far as the plot was concerned, but Isaac feels so much more grounded as a character now that he actually vocalizes and actively engages with the other characters. Further elevating the plot is all of the added material. I was not expecting this, and I found all the added content to the narrative to be a more than welcome surprise. Nicole was already a significant character, but now we get to see more of what she was actually doing aboard the Ishimura between her work hours, and it's actually really interesting. Daniels and Hammond feel like actual people now, rather than just voices which help to get Isaac from point A to B. Even the most minor characters are far more involved in the plot this time around, and I was honestly impressed with just how competently everything was weaved together. And boy, howdy them graphics, woo! I'm usually not one to splurge over some good graphics, especially nowadays where standards are so high that even perfectly serviceable visuals get memed on for being quote-unquote subpar. And it's not as if the original Dead Space doesn't hold up relatively well on its own, but man, this game is just gorgeous. Callisto Protocol is probably the best looking game on the market at the moment, even if that's all it has going in its favor, but the Dead Space remake is no slouch either, both in regards to the visuals and audio. Some of these visuals are honestly breathtaking, and the audio quality is so unbelievably high that I was completely immersed from the moment that I started the game. Seriously, playing this game in the dead of night with a high quality headset, it is unreal. What can I say? Dead Space is a beautifully macabre piece of cosmic horror. The Dead Space remake is exceptional. It's an incredible remake of an incredible game that does all but the most minute of things right. Now I'm just trying to imagine how insane a Dead Space 2 remake of this caliber would be. Oh my god, could you imagine? 9 out of 10, I cannot wait to go back for the Platinum Trophy and see that secret ending. If you haven't already, do yourself a favor and go play this game because it deserves all the love in the world. This is the first game on my backlog that I made a conscious decision not to finish. I've heard for a long time that this game is an underrated gem and a fantastic RPG with great combat and a compelling story, but all I can say after my 11 hours of playtime is that all the praise I've heard for this game was a complete and total farce. Kingdoms of Amalur is an awful video game that at best was literally boring me to sleep, and at worst was genuinely pissing me off. The open world is unfun garbage that's a chore to trek through, and there's nothing about it that makes it worth exploring. The autosave checkpoint system is frustratingly inconsistent, the decently varied build diversity is undercut by a slew of worthless mechanics and combat that is mind-numbingly monotonous and frustratingly shallow, the story is as generic and uninspired as a Western fantasy narrative could possibly get. Seriously, this feels like bad WoW DLC. The voice acting is laughably bad at times. The artistic direction admittedly is solid. Apparently Todd McFarlane worked on this project, so that checks out. But unfortunately, the artistic direction is undermined by the graphics that are dated for even 2012. The OST is bland and repetitive. The progression system has a glacially unsatisfying pace to it. Enemies are tedious to fight and uninspired to look at. Resource management is simultaneously bordering on the non-existent and yet just essential enough to be annoying to keep track of. Look, I'm sorry, I genuinely found nothing about this game to be enjoyable. Why Kingdoms of Amalur is touted as some sort of obscure masterpiece I will never understand, and how the hell it ever managed to get a remaster for modern platforms is frankly beyond my understanding. Needless to say, I'm never going to be playing this game again, let alone bothering to complete it. I'm not going to rate it because that would be unfair since I haven't beaten it, but I can tell you that I had a pretty unfun time with it. This one has been long overdue for me. Assassin's Creed 4 is one of those games that I was never on the hype train for. In fact, I'd go as far as to say the game is just ridiculously overrated, but I also respect it for being such a fresh and expansive addition to the franchise. For me, the thing that kills my enjoyment of Black Flag is the naval combat. Yes, it's a pirate game, and it only makes sense for them to expand on the naval combat following Assassin's Creed 3, and yes, there was clearly a lot of work put into this side of the game, but Jesus Christ, did it overstay its welcome. It can be really awkward to simultaneously try and man the ship while engaging in combat, especially in more cluttered terrains, and not to mention when facing off against multiple enemy vessels, and the combat itself is just so stilted thanks to the use of cooldown-based artillery. Obviously, what's there makes sense, the cooldown is the crew reloading translated to the mechanics, but it's far too repetitive for just how frequently the game employs the naval combat. Between the open world, which is dominated by sailing between the Caribbean islands, and the main story, which includes naval combat for what I have to assume was over half the mission set, I was dying to just be done with it, which is a shame because I think if the naval combat was employed a bit more sparingly, I'd probably have a far more favorable view of it. But as it is, it felt like the game was slowing me down to a halt every time a mission required me to face off against an enemy vessel, or god forbid, multiple of them. What's probably worse though was the sheer consistency of tailing missions in this game. Tailing missions are painfully in abundance in the Kenway Saga, but Assassin's Creed 4 really just takes things way too far. Considering the bulk of naval battles and the story missions, it was on the developers to ensure that non-naval missions were varied and engaging. So what better way to shoot themselves in the foot than by having so many of the non-naval missions be one of the most universally despised objective archetypes to be found throughout gaming. I don't know why the tailing missions are so prominent in the Kenway Saga, but I hope to Christ that they start being phased out by the time of Unity and Syndicate. Also, I want to know which one of y'all Ubisoft assigned the El Tiburon boss, because this fight was awful. Not only was it frustrating to literally only be able to use a single method of attack to deal damage, that being firearms, because why would stealth assassinations work in Assassin's fucking Creed, but the fact that you had to be completely anonymous to pick up the ammo from the crates was sincerely painful to deal with. This fight is easily among the worst bosses to ever appear in this franchise, and I hope to never fight anything like this again with these games. I hated this fight so much, you don't understand. Or maybe you do, I don't actually know what the popular opinion on this fight is. Aside from that, the bulk of my non-naval specific issues are those you'll find me having with every other game in the Kenway Saga. Awkward collision detection, parkour botches galore thanks to the approximations of the movement system, texture pop-ins, and occasional visual glitches. There is a lot that I personally enjoy about the Kenway Saga, but I cannot deny that the technical issues are unfortunately a very prominent part of the experience, even in the remasters of the non-Black Flag entries. Also, I don't really know what this was about, but for some reason the subtitles for this game were really bad. So many random words were capitalized, and I noticed multiple typos and minor grammatical errors throughout my time with the game. I don't know who was responsible for subbing this game, but I hope they got assigned to a different position for future entries because this clearly wasn't their forte. That probably sounds mean, but I don't know, it's one of those things. I know it's a nitpick, but it annoys the crap out of me. Dragon Ball Xenoverse also does this, and bear in mind that game is still getting updated, and yet those typos still exist, so hey, at least I can let Black Flag off for this one. Another issue I had was the modern day storyline. Now, there were definitely aspects of it that I appreciated, like how Abstergo uses the entertainment industry as a front for exploring the memories of Assassins and Templars, and I'll always enjoy seeing Sean and Rebecca doing their thing, but you could also tell they really had no idea what to do without Desmond at the forefront of the modern day plot. It's also, frankly, strange, after the massive cliffhanger that was AC3's ending, that they decided to keep things so relatively calm and uneventful. Like, there's a prehistoric AI god on the loose after an attempt to save the planet from the solar flares of 2012, but don't worry, the world's fine, I guess, and that AI is just now aimlessly floating in the ether, probably. I really hate it when stories follow a cliffhanger by doing more setup. It's like, no, follow up with the thing first, then you can start setting shit up again. Just, like, why do writers do this? It bothers the crap out of me. But hey, even with all of its issues, I know it probably sounds like I hate this game, but I should say that I still had a mostly good time with Assassin's Creed 4. Edward Kenway really is as great as everyone says. Don't know if I'd put him at the level of Ezio or even Bayek, but the man is easily among the better protagonists of the series, and even when he's being a total dick, he's just so endearing and charming that you can't help but root for the guy. You can tell he's putting on a front, and the moments where he shows himself to truly care go a long way in rallying the audience to his side. As far as I'm concerned, he's easily the best protagonist of the Kenway Saga, with the only one that even comes close being the protagonist of this game's DLC, Adewale. Even though he doesn't play an especially active role in the main game, he never ceased to be a likable counterbalance to the boisterous, sometimes arrogant facade that Edward put on as captain of the Jackdaw, so it was really nice to see the full extent of his character finally unraveled in Freedom's Cry. Adewale is easily among my favorite protagonists to ever grace this series so far. The man is one of the most outright intimidating assassins ever depicted in the franchise, and yet he also has such a softness and approachability to him that makes him so much easier to root for. But if we're talking about characters, you know we've got to show some respect for James Kidd, aka Mary Reed, aka the best Assassin's girl before Aya. Mary is basically Mulan, but for pirates and assassins, having taken on the persona of James Kidd, illegitimate son of the famous Captain Kidd. Throughout the story, Mary progressively opens up to Edward as their relationship deepens, eventually forging a very sincere and honestly heartwarming friendship, which tragically culminates in what was easily one of the most emotional moments of the series, with Mary dying of illness before Edward after having been captured by Templars. This moment was executed perfectly, and while the graphics may not hold up as well as other games of the time, the facial expressions of Edward in this scene were perfectly animated and really drove the impact of this scene home. Seriously, y'all better be pressing F in the comments to pay respects because Mary earned every bit of it. As far as gameplay goes, aside from the naval combat, there really isn't that much to be said that couldn't already be said about Assassin's Creed 3, Liberation, and also Rogue. Combat is satisfying enough, I enjoy the various Assassin's tools, and stealth is certainly an option, sometimes kind of. But aside from that, I don't really think I have that much to say. At this point, Assassin's Creed was as much of a stealth game as Delden Rolls? What? At this point, Assassin's Creed was as much of a stealth game as Dark Souls, so with that direction in mind, I wish they'd have at least thought to do a bit more with the combat. Obviously, Origins uprooted the combat entirely, so I'd like to see this system brought to its fullest potential before it's too late. In the end, Assassin's Creed 4 is a very flawed but still very enjoyable game. It has a lot of issues, and I don't think I'll be coming back for the Platinum Trophy, but what's there is pretty good, and I can see at least why people enjoy it as much as they do, minus the naval combat, which just did not click with me at all, especially in the game's closing chapters where I was just dying for it to be over with. Is Assassin's Creed 4 the peak of the series? No, it's far from it. But it is a solid 6 out of 10. I'm sure someone is hearing that and thinking,
Loveless, a 6? Are you fucking crazy? Assassin's Creed 4 is the best in the franchise.
But you have to remember that, for me, a 6 is above average. Were there not so much holding the game back? I could easily see the best aspects of the game elevating it to an 8 even, but great characters can only get a game so far before the rest of the game will weigh it down. And unfortunately, Assassin's Creed 4 just has way too many problems for me to be able to agree with the popular opinion that it's among the best in the franchise. It's good, but it's not that good. Spider-Man 2 is easily my game of the year for 2023, without a doubt. It feels like they took everything that made the first game in Miles Morales so good and polished the hell out of them mechanically while delivering on all the promise of a solid sequel. As far as the gameplay goes, there's little to complain about. Enemy variety has thankfully been cranked up well beyond that of the first game, and the mix of Miles and Peter's unique abilities do a terrific job at keeping the gameplay fresh and exciting. Add to that the wealth of new web slinging and traversal mechanics such as the web wings and the aerial dashes, and Spider-Man 2 feels every bit as much of an improvement over the first two games as it ever needed to be. They took a spectacular foundation for fun superhero gameplay and they made it better. What else is there to really say? But the real meat and potatoes of Spider-Man 2 is undoubtedly in the narrative. Oh my god! This game's story and characters went so hard, and damn it all if Yuri Lowenthal didn't put on the performance of an absolute lifetime. Seriously, all the voice work in this game was excellent, no doubt, but some of these lines from Yuri cut straight to the soul. There is a lot to cover with this game's story and characters, so for the sake of pacing this out, I'm going to cover this in 3 sections. The main ensemble of Peter, Miles, MJ, and Harry, the primary antagonists of Kraven, Mr. Negative, and Venom, and finally certain side content including Mysterio, Wraith,
and Carnage.
Starting out with the main ensemble, I really loved the dynamics between Peter and everyone. The opening act of the game does a superb job at establishing how much Peter has grown to care for everyone, and not to mention just how much he cares for Harry especially. All of these relationships feel so sincere and genuine, but man, Peter and Harry's relationship is as real as it gets. From the moment they're reunited, you immediately get the feeling that these two love each other and would do anything for one another. So when the symbiote finally attaches to Peter and Harry starts getting sick again, that weight and stress that comes with it feels all the more earned. When it comes to Peter and Miles, the game does a great job from the offset of showing just how formidable a duo they are when working together. Seeing them take down a rampaging Sandman with relative ease, and then cutting to them just chilling out with one another makes it very clear that these two not only spend a lot of time working together, but that they've grown to care for one another more than ever before. The parallels with Peter and Harry's relationship are very apparent, so when Peter starts ignoring Miles to spend more time with Harry, you can immediately sympathize with Miles and just how alone the guy probably feels, especially after all he's been through and how frustrated he's become. Then there's Peter and MJ, and oh man, was it nice to see these two just having a functioning, healthy relationship, minus the symbiote stuff. Look, I'm just gonna be honest with y'all, I'm a sucker for good romance. Always have been, always will be. And to see Peter Parker and Mary Jane finally have a story where they can just be together was so heartwarming. Which means that the anxiety and frustration of the rising tension in their relationship once the symbiote begins to get to Peter's head feels much more real and dread-inducing as a result. They clearly had some looming conflict, but thanks to the symbiote, everything just becomes so much worse as a result. But before we get to the symbiote, we have got to talk about my man, Kraven the fucking Hunter. This guy, this motherfucker right here, is the GOAT. This might just be the best Kraven ever. Granted, the only real competition is the comic that this game is directly inspired by, but even still, this game knocked Kraven clean out of the park. Hell, they knocked it out of the county. I mean, what can I even say? He's far from a sympathetic villain. I mean, the guy murders people for sport, so he's not exactly Takuto Maruki. But you 100% feel as though you've come to understand him by the time his story comes to an end. Kraven has an inoperable terminal illness, so he wants his final moments to be spent recognizing the peak rather than the limits of his capabilities as a man. Having heard that New York was basically a smorgasbord of super people, he sets his sights on the Big Apple. He kills several villains off screen, including Shocker, Scorpion, and Vulture, and while I wasn't exactly a fan of that, I can respect the fact that they went with characters who simultaneously made an impact, which strongly conveyed just how truly dangerous Kraven was before finally putting us face to face with him, whilst also making it a point to avoid those with especially compelling characterization in the context of these games. I mean, I think we can all agree that not having Shocker in Spider-Man 3 is far from the worst choice they could have made with this game's narrative. Perhaps one of Kraven's worst victims, though, is Dr. Connors, everyone's favorite member of the... Why the fuck did I write this? Alright, I'm gonna read this. Everyone's favorite member of the liberal cabal that has the sweaty potato screaming about gay frogs or something, probably. The man just wants to go about his life and leave the days of the lizard behind him, but unfortunately for him, Kraven has a hard-on for a good hunt and not only wants to hunt a mini Gojira, but he also needs bait for the fabled Spider-Man, his real prey. And that's when things start to get really interesting.
I see a man. I sense a beast.
But before we get to talking about that, let's take a bit to talk about Miles and Mr. Negative, because his arc in Spider-Man 2 might just be one of my favorite arcs in any Spider-Man media. I really love the story they told with Miles here. It's thematically classic Spider-Man, but without feeling like a copy-paste of previous Peter Parker tales, a balancing act that I'm sure is pretty damn difficult given the sheer volume of Spider-Man media in the modern age. And not to mention the fact that they managed to stretch this arc so seamlessly over 3 whole games is extremely impressive. After losing his father and sort of girlfriend, the latter of whom turned begrudging heel until finally redeeming herself through sacrifice, Miles has been through the emotional ringer, to put it mildly. Now more than ever, he needs those closest to him, and for the most part, he has a solid foundation for emotional support. However, Peter Parker is the only one that he can truly rely on to understand the struggle of being a Spider-Man. So when Peter begins to distance himself from Miles, Miles finds himself more and more isolated, giving him more time in his own head, where he begins to linger on his desire for vengeance against Martin Lee for the death of his father. The whole arc feels so organic and comes so naturally, and it's great that they made sure not to take the spotlight completely off of Miles. It would have been so very easy to just make a symbiote-focused story with Miles on the back burner, but they did a terrific job with ensuring that wasn't the case, and I seriously cannot commend them enough for their dedication to Miles as a character. What's even more impressive is the fact that Miles' arc doesn't conclude how you might think. I really was expecting Lee to end up sacrificing himself for redemption, but that moment never came, and I'm glad. And most importantly, Miles doesn't actually forgive him either. In one of the most heartfelt and best written scenes in this series so far, Miles drops one of my all-time favorite lines, probably from any protagonist across media.
Well, if this is my last chance to say anything to you, I won't forgive you. It's just not in me. But I can't carry this hate for you anymore, man. So let's set things right. You and me.
This moment is genuinely brilliant, but it also wouldn't hit nearly as hard if Martin Lee wasn't so spectacularly characterized in the first game as well as this one. Even since the first game, you never got the feeling that Lee was sinister or malicious. He was always sympathetic despite his actions, and you never wanted to see him burn for the crimes that he committed. And I really appreciate that the writers for this game recognize that, because I think Lee has been through more than his fair share of emotional turmoil, and having to live with what's been done to him as well as what he's done to others is clearly more than enough pain for this character to go through, and not to mention worse than whatever Miles could ever do to him. But I think it's high time we got back to the main course, that lovely black sludge that we all know and love. I fucking loved the symbiote storyline of the first two acts, with Peter growing more and more vengeful and volatile as he spent more and more time wearing the black suit, and Insomniac did not skimp on any of the details that we've come to love regarding the symbiote. I've always loved the scenes with the symbiote acting as a seemingly living substance that the characters don't quite understand, but Insomniac takes it a step further by showing us the symbiote acting fully on its own while Peter is supposed to be sleeping, and oh my god, it is terrifying. Like, this is something Sam Raimi would direct.
MJ.
Oh my god, Tony Todd is the GOAT! But alright, yeah. It's about at this point that the other characters have started seeing the red flags, and Harry is, on the verge of not being alive. But Peter, oh my god, this guy.
This suit is the only reason I'm still alive.
Yeah, it's pretty great, isn't it?
Why don't you pop some more pills and say what you're really feeling?
Hey.
Bro, there was no need. What the fuck? We thought Bully Maguire was a savage, but Bully Lowenthal brought the fucking heat. I have never seen so little chill in a dude that he would try and provoke his dying friend just for wanting to not die. Harry really said, "Pete, I'm suffering, please help." And he took it personally. Hell, Kraven literally wants to die, and Peter took that personally too. These quips really went from a bad guy exclusive to being rated E for everyone way too fast, but nobody was getting the smoke quite like Kraven. I don't know if it was Peter's anger carrying over to the symbiote or what, but oh my god, when Venom finally starts talking to him and saying, "Kill Kraven," you could just tell that shit was about to hit the fan, and boy did it. I seriously cannot believe we got Peter Parker in the black suit as a boss fight. Part of me was going in expecting it to be a cathartic beatdown, but instead what I got was an emotional peak that perfectly capped off the first 2 acts, whilst also kicking off the third and final perfectly. And while we're on the subject, I'll just go ahead and say, yeah, all the bosses in this game are seriously fantastic. Scream, Mysterio, and Kraven were probably my 3 favorites. Actually, not even probably. Those fights were so good. But anyways, after the emotional fever pitch that was the Peter boss fight, we finally get the scene that everyone has been waiting for. The one and only, ladies and gentlemen. And everyone clapped. No, seriously, getting to play as Venom rampaging through Oscorp might just be the best moment in this series so far. My girlfriend and I were absolutely ballistic for this set piece, and it did not disappoint in the slightest. Especially with the final fight with Kraven to cap it off. Also, major props to Insomniac for simultaneously blending Venom's style of combat perfectly with the base mechanics, whilst also ensuring that he felt entirely unique from either of the Spider-Men. But yeah, that final fight with Kraven might just be the highlight of the game for me. And seeing Venom bite the dude's head off before going on to manipulate Harry into compliance with Venom's plan to create a planet symbiote was the perfect kickoff to the final act of this story. The focus of the final act is definitely more so on Peter than it is Miles, but I think that's fine since the final act is meant to serve as a send-off to Peter while setting up Miles, and also Silk in the credits, as the primary protagonist. Peter Parker deserves a proper send-off, and boy did he get one. After all that Peter has been through with Harry and MJ, having to fight the both of them in a desperate attempt to free them from the symbiotes was just as intense as it needed to be. Part of what makes the symbiote so good is that it accentuates the flaws and potential tragedy in the host character. So when MJ's internal struggle to balance her life with Peter and Harry's desperation to live and make the world a better place manifest as foes that take a while to bring down, it leaves a lot of room for the characters to interact, and Insomniac took full advantage. Like I said, Yuri Lowenthal puts on the performance of a lifetime in this game. I don't know what it was, but the man put everything he had into this performance, and I really appreciate that he did because this was one hell of a climax. I mean, we got winged Venom, for God's sake. This is straight out of Todd McFarlane's sketchbook. You know it is. The best final battles in Spider-Man stories always feel so high stake thanks to the way the characters are written, and Insomniac's Spider-Man 2 is no exception. Peter's concern for Harry not only feels painfully real, but it's something that you can't help but relate to thanks to how likable and human that Harry has felt throughout this game and even the first game. A tragic ending felt all but inevitable, but in another surprising defiance of expectations, Insomniac actually went for a happy ending to a Spider-Man story, and thank God for that. Don't get me wrong, I appreciate a good tragedy as much as the next guy, but not every Spider-Man story needs to be a merciless beatdown of Peter Parker. His character went through more than enough throughout the events of this story, and not to mention the previous game, so for him to get a mostly happy ending was a real relief, and not to mention a breath of fresh air. That's not to say everything winds up peachy, even with the miraculous ladybugging of the symbiotes, but seeing Harry rushed off to receive medical care was far from the worst case scenario, and seeing Peter put down the suit and leave the city in Miles' hands was such a perfect way to wrap up Peter, MJ, and Miles' character arcs. Oh, and we're getting Silk. As a fan of Silk, I gotta say I'm pretty excited. Now if we can just get Ghost Spider, I will be golden. But we're not done. Oh no, cause my boy Mysterio finally made it into Insomniac's Spider-Man, and wow, they did him so right. First of all, that design, chef's kiss. Bon magnifique. Oh yeah, I should probably mention that Mysterio is my all-time favorite Spider-Man villain, so am I biased? Yeah. The real surprise of this side quest was the fact that, spoiler alert, Mysterio actually wasn't the bad guy. Probably. The whole subplot has you thinking that Mysterio is trying to pull one over on Miles, who, unlike Peter, has never fought the fishbowl sporting magic man up to this point, but as it turns out, Mysterio was actually being held captive and framed. I was genuinely so surprised, and while I don't want Mysterio to just go back to being a badman, I'd really love to see more of Quentin Beck's character at some point in the future, maybe even helping Miles. Who knows what the future holds? And speaking of the future, oh man. Oh, man.
That's what all this was for. And when the
crimson hour rolls over this earth, it shall bring truth, judgment, and carnage.
There are no units of measurement that will ever be able to properly encapsulate the sheer volume of nut unleashed when I watched this for the first time. I wish I could put into words how mind-bogglingly, world-shattering, outstanding this reveal was. So yeah, Wraith was pretty cool too. I really like seeing her operate as a fugitive that works with Spider-Man from time to time, plus Yuri is just such a good character that, oh my god, we're getting Carnage. It's a 9 out of 10. I absolutely adore Spider-Man 2 and will 1000% be coming back for the Platinum Trophy and whatever content drops along the way. Hopefully it's better than the City That Never Sleeps DLC the first game got, and I imagine they'll be holding off on Carnage for Spider-Man 3, unless the leaks are to be believed. But for now, I am very happy with what we have. Spider-Man 2 rules. Little Big Planet is goated, and anyone who says otherwise should be ostracized and shunned from society, and also probably be given a chemical castration also, but that's just my opinion. In all seriousness, this one really felt good to finally knock out, for multiple reasons. I got the game back when the PS5 first launched, and I was really enjoying it at the time, but with all that I was doing between moving across the country and trying to start my YouTube channel, it ultimately fell to the wayside and into my backlog. Thankfully, not only did I actually get around to beating it, but I did so with my once and future love, and it felt really special to finally have completed a game together. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is just a terrific video game that really brings me back to the old days of gaming with adorable mascot characters, fun platforming levels with challenges and secrets to conquer and uncover, and they managed to do so much with such simple mechanics that it truly makes me wonder why games like this aren't as common as they used to be. I get that massive open worlds and deep storytelling games are all the rage, and that's well and fine, but man, there's just something magical about these light-hearted, old-school platformers that I really enjoy. I will say that Sackboy does feel rather light on crossover content compared to past Little Big Planet titles, with only a handful of other PlayStation characters being featured, and not to mention only within the thankfully free DLC updates. Don't get me wrong, these are appreciated, especially since they are free. I really cannot praise them enough, but also, where's my Spider-Man Sackboy? Especially with the way Spider-Man has become such a prevalent title amongst the modern PlayStation catalog. Just feels like they could do a lot more, you know? I was also admittedly a bit disappointed by the lack of custom levels, some of which I have very fond memories of, like Shark Attack, which might actually be the greatest player-made content in the history of video games. No, I'm not joking, it is the best. But I will admit that the blow is substantially softened given just how many levels and secrets there are to replay and track down. Still though, Shark Attack was goated. I also gotta say that I really appreciated the use of both two-dimensional and three-dimensional level design, and just how seamlessly the game bounces between the two. For decades we've had Mario games completely split between 2D and 3D titles, but Sackboy really is out here saying "por qué no los dos" like it's nothing. It allows for such a healthy variety in level design and maintains a sort of freshness to the general play that I honestly don't think I can recall seeing it anywhere else. Sackboy: A Big Adventure is easily among my favorite PS5 games. Am I biased? Well, obviously. It's the first game that I ever completed with the love of my life, and it simultaneously made me feel immense nostalgia whilst being such a fresh gaming experience. Sackboy rules. I can't wait for the Astrobot game. I give it an 8 out of 10, and I am excited to go back for the Platinum Trophy. Thank God Almighty, I am finally out of the Kenway Saga. Yes! Assassin's Creed Rogue is a game that I've been interested in playing for a while now. It was the last Assassin's Creed game to be released on 7th gen consoles, and was also the final entry to the Kenway Saga, with the conclusion of the story laying the groundwork for what would be Assassin's Creed Unity. There is a lot to like about Assassin's Creed Rogue, the first and foremost being, of course, that the protagonist is a rogue assassin that had betrayed the Brotherhood in favor of the Templars. That is an immediately enticing premise for these games, especially given it was the 8th entry into the franchise, and I think the story does a really good job at characterizing Shay and why it is that he fell out of the Brotherhood. That sequence in Lisbon is genuinely fantastic and did an excellent job of showing just how claustrophobic, what the What the fuck? Catastrophic the precursor relics could be if put into the wrong hands, be they of the Assassins or the Templars. But what really makes all of this work is that Shay isn't immediately out for blood against the Brotherhood. He doesn't want to kill them all right away, he just wants to ensure that they fail, so as to protect innocent people who don't even know what's happening in this ancient underground war. When the time finally comes for Shay to have to kill his former brothers, it's clear that he has reservations and wishes there was another way, which is great setup for his eventual choice to spare Achilles when all is said and done. The game's overall story just feels perfectly placed within the timeline of these games. We get to see the end of the remaining assassins of Black Flag, we get to see all the necessary setup for Assassin's Creed 3, we get multiple references to what happened following Evelyn's quest and liberation, and we get a strong segue into Assassin's Creed Unity. I mean, the release of the game was obviously quite mismanaged, but playing the games in order now, it works as a satisfying conclusion to the Kenway Saga and a perfect jump-off point for Unity. If only the modern day story were even half as interesting. It's basically a half-baked attempt at following up on Black Flag's modern day plot, which itself was pretty bare bones and uneventful. It's really bizarre too, because the culmination of what little there is just reiterates that Abstergo Entertainment is ran by the Templars, as if we haven't known that since the first game was released nearly a decade before Rogue. So, thanks, I guess, for the plot revelation. As far as the gameplay goes, well, it's basically Black Flag, but it does have less naval combat, which, hey, that's a step in the right direction if you ask me. But dear God, I really hope Unity does away with it entirely, or at the very least makes it completely optional. Man, I hate naval combat. It sucks. It just sucks. It has zero depth, hinges upon a boring, grindy upgrade system, follows a very basic and repetitive formula, and overall is just a frustrating encroachment on what should be otherwise solid, albeit iterative gameplay. Imagine how much better the rest of the game would be without the naval combat. Imagine the spectacle of combat whilst on board the ships with all kinds of hectic dogfighting going on in the background, while trying to fight your way through enemy vessels and accomplish more than just killing 10 enemies. There is so much potential for a crazy spectacle here, but it's ruined by the insistence of Ubisoft to have players awkwardly steering these slow ships so they can repeatedly fire cannons at another ship that itself is stuck doing the same thing. It honestly baffles me that Ubisoft was so satisfied with the underdeveloped naval combat of Assassin's Creed 3 that they recycled it twice with only the bare minimum of updates and improvements possible. Why did they insist on this to the extent that they did? The best thing about Rogue's combat by far, though, is the fact that Shay is a Templar, meaning that you fight assassins, and their inclusion to Rogue was done pretty well if I do say so myself. When assassins are near, you'll begin to hear whispers, a tense audio cue to let you know to pop your eagle vision, but finding them isn't as simple as just using eagle vision and going up to the highlighted target and pressing square. When assassins are uncovered, they won't be immediately highlighted. You do have to find them yourself without being seen, at which point it's on you to concoct a method of counter-assassination. I seriously love these encounters, and I wish this could be incorporated by some means in future titles. Give me another Templar title if these kinds of mechanics come with it. I'd be down. Regarding Rogue's story, I know I said the story was good, and it mostly is, but can someone please riddle me how it is that Shay Patrick Cormac managed to survive being shot in the back and falling down a 50-foot cliff before landing face first, feet pointed up, on solid ice before washing away in the freezing cold waters of the North Atlantic? Because the game just glosses over this like it didn't even happen. Yeah, you took a nasty fall there, boy, but don't worry, we took you in and nursed you right back to health in a handful of days. I'm sorry, what? And I thought Radun Hagedun taking a cannonball to the sternum was stupid. Shay Patrick Cormac should not be alive after this moment. We all know it. So yeah, AC Rogue's alright. And I will say I appreciated that it didn't feel overly padded and drawn out with the boring naval combat like Black Flag. I mean, it still had some, yeah, and I still think it sucked as always, but at least it wasn't happening every other mission. I'd probably give Rogue a 6 out of 10. It's up there with 3 and Black Flag as far as my personal enjoyment goes, and I'm happy to say that I finally played it. But I also won't be coming back for the Platinum Trophy either, at least not in the foreseeable future. Although I will say if it's as easy as the Assassin's Creed Liberation Platinum, I might come back for it, just because. And with that, the Kenway Saga is finally over. Yeah, it was definitely a step down from the Ezio trilogy, but like I said, I'm glad that I finally got to it, and I think there is a lot of good to take from it as well, mainly with the interesting characters setting and the deepening of the conflict between the Assassins and Templars. Just, please, never do naval combat again. Seriously, naval combat, please go away. Forever. It's more of a meme now for me at this point, but I really just did not enjoy whenever I had to do the naval combat. I just thought it sucked. I'm sorry. If you like it, props to you, man. I'm jealous of you. Genuinely, I am jealous of the fact that you can enjoy it because I just can't.